Beginning with the second chapter, it is important to understand that a lot of times in the book, author Sai Deepak has put a lot of notes, end notes, and references, and it's not practically possible for me, while summarizing the book or the chapter, to quote each and every reference and each and every note and give credit to that particular source from which author Sai Deepak has derived his authority. Hence, when I'm using the term summary or the author, it might mean that the author has taken it from a source and has quoted it in a book. But for that particular instance, I'm using the author's name and not the reference name, because it would be necessary to do that for the purpose of summary. Otherwise, the summary would get awfully long and cumbersome and it would lose its essence. So that being said, at times when Sai Deepak has clearly mentioned a particular author in the book itself, in the text itself, in the main chapter itself, then I would try to inculcate their particular views while giving my summary. That being said, let's start with the second chapter, which is the discovery of coloniality and the birth of decoloniality. So, the demand for freedom arose in a lot of the native colonies after multiple years or multiple centuries of colonialism. And this demand for freedom arose because of many reasons, but some of the main reasons was that the colonialism had taken a huge toll on them, and it had been years since they were serving as colonial slaves in the colonizing empires. And these aspirations of these colonies to gain independence gained limelight, especially due to the role of education and the politico legal infrastructure of the European colonizers, which was introduced by them along with the education system that they introduced. When the native elites and other individuals got through them, they used this education system to talk about independence, but this independence was not on the lines of the original idea that they were living before the colonialism. But because of the infrastructure of the European colonialism, their vision of independence was also clouded by the colonial structure, which is to say, their ideas or their worldview was shaped by the colonial mindset. They did not now wanted to go back to their own society. They just wanted political independence, but culturally and on other fronts and the worldview front, their idea was still European in nature because of the colonial mindset. Thus, this vision of independence was also clouded because of the European mindset. It could be because of the way of their education. But then Sai Deepak tells us about a more pragmatic consideration, which is to say that the world structure after years of colonialism was Europeanized and westernized in a lot of way, which is to say that the world was an integrated world, and it was very difficult for these societies to ignore the world happenings and completely go back to their own past systems, because otherwise they would not be able to interact effectively with the global world and effectively have a say in the global world. And hence it was necessary for them to integrate in the world because of the certain systems that the European nations had placed and certain limitations that were placed on them by the global considerations. Then two categories of nations are talked about by the author. One one kind of nations which after the end of colonialism were aware of their Indic roots and their Indic consciousness and wanted to reclaim as much of their past as possible, and given the practical considerations try to reconcile it, their past and their culture, in as much possible way as they could and reclaim it and reclaim their Indic consciousness to go away from the colonial mindset and the colonial legacy and try to compensate for years of colonialism. The second kind of nations were those nations which had a lot of colonialized native elites, which although were people who had gotten independence, but these native elites, their thought process was completely that of their original colonizers. And because these native elites thought like that, they still were of the opinion of subverting the masses at large in the process of nation building. These native elites were of the mindset of a European mold, and that is why the path that their country took towards independence was also very European in nature, which led to a lot of people, the general masses, being treated as outcasts in the nation building process, which again led to a loss of identity, roots, and other particular things. Which brings us to the aspect of Western imperialism, which is the present day form of the European colonialism. So, the Western imperialism herein pertains to the legacy of coloniality. Western imperialism refers to a globalized, interconnected world where the European worldview is still accepted, and to a large extent, the colonization in the minds of these erstwhile colonies is still there, even though they have gained political independence. And this Western imperialism has caused a lot of benefits to these European nations, because now they do not have to claim any responsibility also, or any burden also, which they had to claim when they had their colonies. They can simply now shrug away their responsibility, even though the thought process that they have left is completely colonial in nature. They can completely shrug away their burden and responsibility, even though the impact of the subjugation of population was more direct and visible during the colonialism. But the Western imperialism and the way it has shackled the minds of these nations is something which they can completely ignore. Which brings us to how, even during the Cold War era, a lot of countries had to take sides, or the erstwhile colonies had to take sides between the warring nations, even though they were not directly parties to it. And even when they did not take sides, they were forced to be caught in the crossfires between the two superpowers. And all of this led to a lot of scholarship coming about in the late 1980s. One pioneer of this scholarship was Anibal Quijano, who was a Peruvian sociologist in the late 1980s, who talked about coloniality as a mindset. Now, this mindset, according to Anibal Quijano, this mindset is a mindset of European supremacy. This mindset, which is still there in the colonized nations, which were earlier colonized, pertains to how Europe has monopolized the time, which is to say the time space, and the time space, which is to say that all of the events after the colonialism started are of importance, and the nation's own history is something which can be completely ignored. And furthermore, the subjectivity, which is to say the Indic consciousness of these nations, are no longer important, and the only thing that has to be dealt with is in the way that the European nations deem fit, and the universal framework is something that these European nations decide, and all of these things are to be decided by the European colonizers. This coloniality as a mindset is something that Anibal Quijano has talked about in detail. Which brings us to decoloniality. The decoloniality was something which these decolonial scholars found as a solution to the problem of coloniality. A lot of scholars have been mentioned with regards to those who talked about decoloniality. In particular, decoloniality has been talked about as a movement to reclaim and restore the indigeneity and the subjective interpretation of these so called universal values. This decoloniality is one of the solutions to fight the problem of coloniality as opposed to the postmodern and post colonial schools of thought.